1877 Texas. The Black River Orphanage, the 44 children who never appeared in records. In the summer of 1877, as the Texas sun scorched the plains and turned farmland into dust, a new building rose beside the slow black waters of the Brazos River. It was called the Black River Orphanage. It appeared like a mercy, red brick trimmed in white, 2 stories high with a bell tower that rang only once when it opened. The land around it was dying. Crops failed. Livestock collapsed in brittle grass. And families, broken by the weight of hunger and loss, began arriving with children they could no longer feed. They came in wagons and on foot, some carrying sleeping infants wrapped in tattered quilts. They came with shame in their eyes and hope in their hands. No one questioned the miracle that someone had come to help. No one asked where the funding came from or who had paid for the land. They simply gave their children to Reverend Elias Grivens, the man who greeted them with soft smiles and outstretched arms and returned home with fewer mouths to feed. Reverend Grivens had arrived from somewhere east, though no one could name the place. He spoke in the voice of a calm father, one who knew the weight of sorrow and the shape of grief. He wore black wool in the heat and never seemed to sweat. To the townsfolk of Stillwater Bend, he was a gift, quiet, devout, and strangely comforting in a time when even preachers were abandoning their posts for cities with running water. Grivens never preached in the local church, but he was often seen walking the riverbank with a Bible in one hand and a child's drawing in the other. He said he believed in the restoration of innocence. That was all anyone needed to hear. From the start, the orphanage was busy. Within weeks, it held over 20 children, some no older than 5, some nearly grown. The townspeople offered extra clothing and food, though most had little to spare. Occasionally, a boy might be seen in town on an errand, thin but smiling, always escorted by a quiet woman in a gray bonnet. They never stayed long. And slowly the children stopped appearing altogether. Grivens said they were ill and needed rest. He claimed he was protecting their spirits from worldly corruption. Few questioned him. Those who did were reminded of how much worse things might have been without him. It was hard to argue with a man who fed orphans when no one else could. Behind closed doors, however, the walls of the orphanage held something colder than charity. The air inside remained strangely cool even in peak summer, as if the stone retained something deeper than shade. Windows were rarely opened. Children were not allowed near the river unsupervised, though they could hear it at night, a slow, dragging sound like heavy breathing just beneath the current. The nuns who worked under Grivens never spoke unless spoken to, and their eyes always looked down. New staff arrived but never stayed long. One nurse left after only 3 days and never returned to collect her wages. When the sheriff came to ask why, Grivens handed him a letter written in delicate cursive that claimed she had family sickness in Georgia. The handwriting did not match hers, but the sheriff never followed up. Everyone trusted Reverend Grivens. Everyone wanted to believe. It was only the children who knew, and even they only understood it in fragments. A sense that some doors should not be opened, that certain stairwells were colder than others, that the rooms on the west wing whispered when no one was looking. They knew the 3rd bell at night meant someone would not return to their bed. They knew to fake sleep. They knew to forget the names of the ones who vanished. The Black River ran silent beside the property, dark and unmoving even when it rained. And something about that silence crept inside the building itself, dampening sound, making it harder to scream and easier to disappear. Outside, the town went on. The drought lifted slightly in September. A few families saw their crops return. Stillwater Bend began to heal. The mayor praised the orphanage during Sunday service, calling it a pillar of salvation. Children were being saved, he said. What he didn't know, what no one outside the building could know, was that by then 9 children had already vanished without a trace. Their names were never written in the official registry. Their beds had been stripped and assigned to new arrivals. No graves were dug, no questions were asked. The paperwork said they were never there. And by winter the Black River would rise just enough to swallow what the earth could no longer hide. Reverend Elias Grivens walked through the orphanage halls like a man carrying light in his chest. His voice never rose above a hush, and his touch was soft, always landing gently on shoulders or the backs of small hands. He wore a dark wool coat even in the thickest heat, buttoned to the throat, and never once showed anger in public. His eyes, framed by round glasses, held a tired kindness that made parents weep when handing over their starving children. He would kneel with them in prayer before taking the child's hand, and as the wagon rolled away, he remained standing in the dirt road, one hand raised in blessing. From a distance, it was a picture of mercy. Up close, there was something else, a stillness in his face that didn't match his words, a delay between hearing and answering, like he was listening to something louder inside his own mind. He never asked for payment. He only asked for silence. No visiting hours, no letters, no updates. He said he believed in full spiritual rebirth, and that required detachment from worldly noise. The families agreed because what else could they do? This was the only place that would take their children. They clung to his promises. They trusted the slow, comforting way he spoke. They saw only the warmth. They did not see the office he kept locked behind the chapel, the one with no keyhole on the outside and no windows at all, the one where the floor had been dug up and replaced with concrete mixed with crushed limestone and animal ash, the one where the air held no dust, where every sound was swallowed before it reached the walls. Inside that room, Reverend Grivens wrote, he kept no sermons, no family letters, and no financial records. Instead, he filled red notebooks with diagrams of human growth, pain charts drawn in pencil, and maps of nerve clusters sketched with notes in the margins like "Truth lives here" and "Remove to purify." He labeled pages with numbers instead of names. Each child was assigned a symbol, a star, a hook, a branch, or a nail. These weren't codes. They were markers. He believed the soul could be shaped by external discipline, not corrected, shaped. He spoke of cleansing, not punishment. He wrote of purification through sensation. The body as gateway, the scream as signal. He believed certain sounds revealed which parts of the soul had not yet surrendered. He had spent years, perhaps decades, listening, experimenting, perfecting the rituals in his own head before bringing them west. Texas, he believed, was empty enough, dry enough, forgotten enough. The children obeyed him, some because they were afraid, others because they believed he truly loved them. That was the part he knew how to fake best. He called them his flock, his lambs, his blessed mute witnesses. He said he would lead them to clarity, and for those who faltered, there was the office. Not many returned from it. Those who did came back slower, quieter. One girl no longer blinked. One boy's hair fell out in handfuls, though his scalp bore no burns. Another child began drawing concentric circles on the walls in his own waist, unable to speak again. Reverend Grivens logged every result in his red books, and when a new child arrived, he would open a fresh page and wait. Watch. Measure how long it took before the child broke a rule, any rule, even silence, especially silence. He did not believe he was doing wrong. In his mind, this was not cruelty, this was salvation. He had seen what he called the hidden rot, the sin behind children's smiles, the decay under their skin. He believed God had whispered the method to him in the winter of 1864, during a month-long fast where he slept beside a dying calf and did not drink water. He came out of that month changed. And everything that followed, the drawings, the white room, the copper, the masks, came from that voice. He obeyed it. He fed it. And when he locked the office from the inside, when he peeled the skin from a child's heel to study their reaction, when he dripped wax onto their soft palate to seal temptation, he did so with a prayer in his mouth and a cross in his hand. From the outside, the building was a miracle, but inside, a man with gentle hands was listening to something no one else could hear, and answering it, piece by piece. By the second year of the orphanage's operation, the numbers no longer made sense. 44 children had passed through the gates of the Black River Orphanage. Some dropped off by desperate parents, others carted in by local sheriffs or wandering priests. But when the county clerk tried to reconcile the records during a routine census, only 19 names appeared in the official books. The rest were missing, not crossed out, not transferred, not even listed as deceased. Just gone. There were no death certificates, no transfer logs, and no correspondence with other institutions. In the eyes of the state, they had never existed at all. No signatures, no footprints. Just a hollow gap in the numbers, like something had swallowed them before ink could find the page. Inside the orphanage, Reverend Grivens kept his own ledgers, but they were not made for legal review. They were bound in leather and hidden in a locked trunk beneath the chapel floor. Each page bore a single mark, not a name, but a symbol. A curved line, a scratched square, a spiral, a broken star. These marks were matched with descriptions only he could understand. Does not weep at night, resists the cold, responds to copper, fails to scream under bite pressure. Each entry ended with a number, always divisible by 11. The pages had no dates, no destinations, only progress, only transformation. Each child is reduced to an experiment, not in name, but in response. The few staff members who lasted more than a month noticed it in quiet ways. Beds were stripped too soon. Some clothes were never claimed from the laundry. One worker swore she saw Reverend Grivens bury a small pair of shoes behind the annex in the dead of night. But when she brought it up, the others refused to speak. They were paid well. Too well. And there was something in the air, some pressure in the walls that made even the most righteous go still when they saw the Reverend smile too long. It wasn't just silence, it was obedience. He never needed to raise his voice. Outside, the town still praised the orphanage. No one noticed the missing names because no one wanted to. The families who left their children behind were too ashamed to return, and the ones who asked questions received soft letters in careful handwriting, assuring them of the child's well-being, often including scripture and a pressed flower. The flowers were always the same, white anemones grown nowhere near Stillwater Bend. No one asked where they came from. No one wanted to know. The oldest children began to understand what was happening before the younger ones did. They stopped using each other's names after lights out. They whispered in numbers. Some tried to carve their initials into the floorboards beneath their bunks, only to find the wood too soft, as if the foundation had been soaked in something unnatural. Some tried to run. None succeeded. The ones who disappeared were never talked about again. Reverend Grivens called them the lifts. He said they had passed through the veil, that they had been chosen for a greater purpose. The children learnt quickly that asking about them meant being next, so they folded their questions into silence and carried them like bruises. The paper trail faded faster each season. By the time a local inspector visited in late autumn, even the walls seemed to deny the missing. The inspector found records for only 22 children, all recent. The rest, the first arrivals, the ones whose faces had once filled the halls, were nowhere, not erased, just unwritten, like they had never breathed at all. When he asked Reverend Grivens about the missing documents, the man simply placed a hand on the inspector's shoulder and said, "Some souls belong to God before the world can count them." The inspector left that night 2 days early without filing a single concern, and back inside the orphanage in the locked office with no keyhole, a fresh page was turned. A new mark was drawn. The count continued. The west wing of the orphanage was always colder, even in the hottest months, and the air carried a scent no one could place, not rot, not mold, but something sour and metallic that settled in the throat. At the far end of that wing, behind a door with no handle, was a chamber the children whispered about in darkness. They called it the Quiet Room. No one knew where the name started. It had no official purpose, no mention in the blueprints, and no staff ever spoke of it aloud. But sometimes, late at night, a child would be led there by Reverend Grivens himself, and the sound of the door sealing shut would echo down the corridor like the closing of a coffin lid. Some children returned hours later, eyes unfocused, limbs trembling, walking as though their bones were sore from the inside. Others never came back at all. Inside the white room, every surface had been scrubbed with lime and ash. The walls were smooth, sealed with layers of bleached paint that burnt the skin if touched too long. The floor was layered with salt, not sprinkled, but packed several inches thick, covering a network of iron drains embedded in stone. Beneath the salt, thin copper wires ran like veins feeding into a mechanism bolted to the wall. No one but Grivens knew what it measured, but he watched it closely. Some nights he stayed in that room for hours, sitting beside the children, reading in silence while their bodies seized and their teeth cracked from the strain of holding in screams. He said it was necessary, that the silence drew the darkness out, that the ones who screamed were not yet ready. Grivens believed sound was the last tether to the self, that true purity required a full release of the voice. So he created conditions where the mind would unravel quietly, where pain would mount without a single word. He packed salt not just for its sting, but because it muffled footsteps, absorbed vibration, and erased the memory of movement. Children left the room unable to tell whether they had been alone or watched, touched or restrained. Some swore they heard whispers in the walls. Others bit through their lips to stop themselves from speaking. But the ones who made it back always came back changed. And Grivens kept notes, pages of pressure thresholds, nerve response times, saliva thickness, and skin density measured after prolonged stress. He believed the soul could only be seen once the body had exhausted every defense. That fear, when properly nurtured, revealed the core. The room had no windows. The ceiling was low. The walls sweated in winter. And when Grivens stood inside it, he did not pray. He observed. He documented. He learnt. Because to him this was not punishment. It was the holy science of silence, a method to reach the truth no sermon could touch. The white room was not where children were broken. It was where he believed they were stripped bare. And as the wind howled through the orphanage rafters that November, the salt in the floor began to turn pink. Grivens did not clean it. He took it as a sign. The annex sat behind the east wing, through a narrow hallway lined with shelves of old hymnals no one ever read. It was built as a nursery, but it never felt like one. The door to the annex was made of black oak, heavier than any other in the building, and the air beyond it dropped 10 degrees colder no matter the season. Inside were 9 cribs arranged in a perfect circle, each one marked with a letter rather than a name. The room smelt faintly of iron and dried milk, and its windows had been painted over from the outside. The infants kept there were all under 6 months, none yet walking, none yet speaking, and Reverend Grivens insisted they be housed apart from the older children for reasons he described only as spiritual hygiene. Staff were told it was for protection. They were never told what, No one entered the annex after dark. Even the most obedient workers, the ones who feared Grivens more than God, found reasons to finish their duties before the sun dropped. Some said they heard something moving under the floorboards when the moon was high. Others swore the crying would rise and fall in unnatural rhythms, like the infants were being lifted, examined, and then set down again in perfect sequence. Grivens alone kept the key, and if the door ever opened after midnight, no one dared to look directly at it. There was something inside the annex that made grown men forget what they'd walked in to do. One nurse lost all memory of her shift and was found weeping in the pantry hours later with her apron soaked in milk. She left the next day without collecting her pay. Each morning just after the chapel bell, Grivens would visit the annex. He never brought anyone with him. He remained inside for 33 minutes exactly, and when he emerged, his hands were always damp, but never shaking. One crib, always one, would be empty. The others would hold their infants in stiff silence, unmoving, eyes wide as if they had seen something they could not name. The missing infant was never spoken of. No records were adjusted, no questions were raised. If a carer asked where the child had gone, Grivens would gently remind them that no names had been assigned, that the child by law had not yet existed, that their role was not to track what belonged to heaven. He believed infants carried what he called the unfiltered imprint, raw remnants of the soul before memory set in. He claimed their reactions were purer, untouched by guilt or pride, and therefore the most reliable source of truth. Whatever he was studying inside the annex, it was not growth, it was not comfort, it did not care, it was a measurement, reaction. He listened to how long they cried, he watched which direction they turned, he charted which ones went quiet when touched on the crown of the skull. The ones who stopped breathing mid-cry were noted in a separate book, their symbols written in white ink. The crib they left behind was always scrubbed by Grivens himself and then turned slightly clockwise as if marking a new direction for the next to follow. By the third winter, Reverend Grivens began preaching about hunger, not the kind that hollowed the belly, but the kind that peeled the soul clean. He told the staff that food was a barrier to purity, that the act of digestion clouded the inner voice and weakened the spirit's grip. He cited scripture, twisted and bent until meaning vanished, and called it doctrine. Then he made it law. Every child above the age of 6 was ordered to fast for 13 days, consuming only a single cup of salt water each morning and a strip of dried licorice root in the evening. No broth, no grain, no exceptions. It was called the preservation cycle. He claimed it unlocked the divine membrane, a thin place between suffering and salvation where the soul in desperation became visible. The first 3 days passed in silence. Children moved slower, lips cracked and stomachs groaned beneath their cotton uniforms. Some fainted during chores and were dragged back to their cots without comment. By day 5, vomiting began. By day 7, hallucinations. Grivens kept watch, eyes alert to every tremor, every murmur that escaped a dry throat. He believed the body would shed its false self under pressure. That hallucination was revelation. He kept journals on each child's reactions, not names, only numbers and drawings. He drew the shape of their posture on the floor when they collapsed. He wrote down the nonsense they whispered before they passed out. One boy spoke fluent Latin, though he had never been taught. A girl began humming a tune no one recognized until Grivens revealed it matched a hymn from a 14th century monastery in France. He took that as proof. By day 9, the blindness began. 3 children lost vision suddenly, their pupils dilating into glassy discs. One could no longer tell the difference between night and day and began clawing at the windows, sobbing that the sky was too loud. Grivens logged this as an auditory breach and isolated her for further study. By day 10, another boy collapsed in the chapel, blood foaming at his mouth. He had chewed through his own tongue in his sleep. Grivens considered this a divine offering, a surrender of the organ of deceit. The boy was not treated. He was placed in the white room and left alone for 24 hours. When he returned, he could no longer make eye contact. He walked only when told. He was assigned a new number. None of the staff spoke out. They were told this was a sacred trial, that the children were being refined. Those who questioned were reminded of their own sins, their debts, and their silence. Grivens had eyes in every corridor and ears behind every wall. The children learnt to hide their suffering, to cry without sound, and to lick the salt from the floors when no one was looking. Some began to pray to things other than God. By the end of the 13 days, 3 were dead, 6 were blind, and all had forgotten the taste of food. Grivens marked the end of the cycle by ringing the chapel bell 13 times at midnight, barefoot, standing in the snow. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between bells was enough. Reverend Grivens believed the mouth was the entry point of all corruption, where lies were born, where gluttony entered, where doubt took shape in the form of words. By the 4th year of the orphanage, punishment had ceased to be correction and become ceremony. Grivens called it refinement. The children called it the coppering. It began with transgression, sometimes real, often imagined. A whisper after lights out, a missed hymn, a shiver during prayer. These infractions, though small, were marked with a silent nod from Grivens, and the child would vanish for 3 days. When they returned, they were different, slower, quieter, and always marked. Their face would be hidden beneath a copper mask molded to the exact shape of their features, sealed over the eyes and mouth with thin channels left open for breath. The shine of it was dull, hand-beaten, and almost organic. But what made it unbearable was the wax. Once the mask was fitted, Grivens would drip molten wax into the nasal cavity, letting it harden deep inside the sinus passage. This, he claimed, sealed the spirit's escape, locking the child's true self inside until it could be purified. The wax burnt going in. Some screamed, some choked, some never screamed at all, and those were the ones Grivens watched the closest. He believed purity had a sound, that it lived in the scream itself. The mask, once hardened, created a resonance chamber. Grivens would listen, eyes closed, as the child cried out and measure the scream's tone, its pitch, and the way it fractured. A scream too low meant deceit, too sharp meant rebellion. But a scream that wavered on the edge of breaking, trembling in the space between suffering and surrender, that, he said, was the voice of a soul ready to be made clean. The masks were never removed. Once fused, they became permanent, a second skin of silence. The child would be given a new uniform, gray instead of white, and made to sit in the chapel during all waking hours. They could not eat. They could not speak. Their breath hissed through the wax-crusted nostrils, and their tears ran down into the copper mouth, pooling until they could no longer swallow. Grivens called them the witnesses. He claimed they were being prepared for something higher, that they had been marked by God, chosen to show the rest how deep the body must suffer to reach clarity. By spring, there were 6 of them. By summer, 11. None of the staff knew how the masks were made. The forge was never seen. The copper appeared only when needed. Some believed Grivens melted down crucifixes and offering plates. Others whispered that he found the copper already shaped, buried near the river, and only reshaped it to fit. Either way, the metal carried a smell none could forget. Sharp, sweet, and wrong, like wet pennies left too long in fire. The children began dreaming of the masks before they ever saw one. They described their weight, their heat, and their sound. Some claimed to hear singing from behind them, faint and constant, like a lullaby played through teeth. What Grivens had created was not discipline, it was doctrine, a living reminder that pain could be molded and that silence could scream if shaped correctly. And in the chapel, as the 11 witnesses sat motionless beneath the cracked cross, Grivens knelt alone, head bowed, waiting. He believed one of them would speak without speaking, that the wax would melt on its own, that purity once perfect would sing back. Every Sunday, as the sun dipped behind the western tree line and the sky turned the color of old bruises, the bell above the Black River Orphanage rang once, a long hollow toll that echoed across the riverbank and bled into the surrounding fields. Inside the stone halls, the children stopped whatever they were doing and folded their hands. No one spoke. No one asked why. They already knew. It was the vinegar hour. The ceremony that had begun months earlier as a form of so-called purification had evolved into something crueler, more elaborate, and more rehearsed. What Grivens once described as disinfection had become a spectacle. Each step is timed, each movement part of a sick pageant hidden behind sacred language. The older boys were led first, stripped of their clothes by silent workers in gray robes who no longer looked them in the eye. Their feet were raw from weeks of barefoot labor in the garden beds, and their ribs showed clearly beneath the skin. One by one they stepped into the stone basin, a wide, shallow trough carved into the floor of the lower chapel. There, buckets of boiling vinegar mixed with wood ash were poured slowly over their bodies. The heat blistered instantly. The children did not scream, not at first. Grivens demanded silence in the first minute. He believed that true purity could only be reached if the soul was stronger than the body's reflex to cry out. When one broke early, the vinegar was poured again, colder the second time, mixed with crushed thorns and salt. It was said that by the third round the body no longer registered pain but as light. The girls followed, smaller, thinner, and many already carrying scars from past Sundays. Their treatment was no gentler. Their heads were shaved in advance, their fingernails pulled clean to prevent infection, though infection was inevitable. A few had to be carried in, their limbs too weak to support them after weeks of fasting and silence. Grivens always watched from the upper ledge, hands folded, eyes fixed on the altar, as if this ritual somehow absolved him of sin rather than sinking him deeper into it. He never spoke during the ceremony, he only nodded when it was time for the next group. The workers obeyed without question, some had stopped blinking. The floor of the basin had long since been stained black, skin peeled and floated. Patches of flesh clung to the stone like fallen leaves, and the steam that rose from the mixture clouded the upper chapel windows until the light itself seemed to bend. It was theater, not for an audience but for something unseen, something Grivens believed lived beneath the floor, in the salted earth, in the bones of the building itself. He often said pain unlocked a door, that the scream, when held in long enough, became a kind of key. And in these children burnt and blinded and half drowned in chemical fire, he thought he was hearing it turn. After the ritual, the children were left naked to dry against the chapel walls, their skin hissing with the last traces of vinegar. They were not allowed to speak or move until the sun disappeared completely. Any sound before that was punished with another bath. Some begged to be sent to the White Room instead. At least there the pain had edges. The vinegar hour did not end when the buckets ran dry. It lingered in the skin, in the bones, in the places between heartbeat and breath. Some children did not survive it. Grivens never buried them. He said their bodies were already clean, ready for what came next. And whatever came next, he promised, would not require skin at all. As winter pressed its weight across the Black River Valley and the trees shed their bark like old skin, a new ritual took shape within the orphanage walls. One born not from scripture but from Reverend Grivens' growing obsession with the human voice. He believed sound was the last lie a child told, the final mask before surrender. If pain could cleanse the body, then song, he reasoned, could extract the soul. And so, each night after the final bell, the children were led barefoot into the upper chapel and lined shoulder to shoulder beneath the rotting crucifix. There, under dim candlelight and a ceiling stained with soot, they became the Lockjaw Choir. Each child, before entering, received an injection at the base of the neck, a milky tincture drawn from crushed nightshade roots, blended with curare and bone ash, stored in jars labeled only by color. The formula had taken months to perfect. Too much, and they stopped breathing. Too little, and the muscles remained free. But when the dose was right, it worked exactly as Grivens intended. The limbs tensed, the spine straightened. The jaw clenched, not in silence, but in paralysis. A frozen scream held just behind the teeth. And then the music began. Grivens chose the hymns himself, but not from any church book. These were rewritten verses translated from dead languages, stitched together from psalms, curses, and alchemical rites. He played the opening notes on a warped harmonium, its keys rusted and uneven, and as the sound crept through the chapel like something lost in fog, the children began to sing. Or rather, the noise came out of them, high, brittle, and broken. Their mouths barely moved, their throats strained against locked muscles. The choir twisted their pitch until no child sounded human. What came out instead was a chorus of fractured tones, overlapping in dissonant waves like wind scraping glass or teeth cracking underwater. It was a music piece called Sacred Interference, a perfect collision of sound and suffering. Some children collapsed during the second verse, choking on their own saliva, unable to cough or breathe. Those who survived the full hymn were laid on the floor until the muscles softened again, twitching in silence like discarded puppets. Grivens watched every note. He paced behind them barefoot, measuring breath with a pocket watch, sometimes humming along in a voice that was too calm for what he'd built. He believed the tension in their jaws and the quiver in their pitch revealed how tightly the soul was still clinging to the body. The more it shook, the closer it was to release. When one child produced a note so shrill it split a candle, Grivens wept openly. He called it a breach, a moment when the veil between flesh and eternity had torn just enough to let light through. The ceremony lasted precisely 44 minutes. No more. No less. The number, he claimed, mirrored the children unaccounted for in the official ledgers, though he never admitted this aloud. Afterward, the children were not given water, not given rest. They were carried back to their cots and laid down like instruments packed away after a violent performance. Some never woke. Their bodies were quietly removed, and the space they left in the choir was filled without question the next night. The sound never stopped. It only shifted. New voices added, old ones erased. And as the nights grew colder and the injections more precise, Grivens no longer needed to conduct. The choir had learnt to sing without him. Or perhaps, as he believed, something else had begun to sing through them. The baptistry basin had once been a shallow pool used for traditional rites, a place where new orphans were welcomed, their foreheads anointed and their past lives symbolically washed away. But after the third drowning in less than 6 months, no one believed it held water for cleansing anymore. The chapel stank faintly of wet copper and scorched oil, and even the most obedient children flinched when ordered to kneel near it. Grivens, however, said the drownings were not accidents. He called them signs, visitations. Proof that the veil between flesh and God was beginning to thin. He claimed the children who perished were not lost but taken, chosen for something holy. The others, he said, must follow. So he built an altar. It began with shoes. Dozens of tiny pairs taken from the beds of children who vanished during the vinegar hours or disappeared into the annex before dawn. He arranged them in a perfect circle, then filled the gaps with bundles of hair clipped during the shaving rituals. The altar took form slowly, layered with fabric scraps, bone fragments, and even fingernails. Grivens called it the Mound of Offering, but the staff began referring to it in whispers as the Red Gate. Once the structure stood waist-high, he declared the time had come. The red baptism would begin. The first was a girl no older than 10. She had been part of the Lockjaw Choir and had survived 3 injections. Her voice had once cracked the chapel's stained glass window. Grivens claimed she carried a tone not of earth, a frequency born in silence and refined in fire. He selected her for sacrifice, not in rage, but in awe. On the first night of the red baptism, she was laid on the altar atop the shoes and hair. Her arms spread and pinned with iron hooks repurposed from chapel lanterns. No chloroform, neither. Just cold air, candlelight, and Reverend Grivens' voice humming low as he worked. He did not rush. He traced her ribs with chalk, made a small incision beneath the third, and spoke to her softly as he reached inside. She blinked the entire time. The scream never came, either from fear too deep to surface or some drug laced into the candle smoke. When he lifted her heart, still twitching, and held it above the basin, he smiled. The blood hit the water in a slow spiral, and the children watching from the pews said it hissed. Abigail Lane had always been the quiet one among the staff, obedient, plain, barely noticed except for the careful way she bandaged the children's hands after the vinegar rites, or held the smaller ones steady when they trembled before a fasting night. But she noticed everything. Each scream was muted too soon, each crib emptied without explanation, and each new symbol Reverend Grivens etched into the prayer logs after every child vanished. She began to write what she saw, not in a journal, but in the pages of hollowed hymnals she stored beneath the infirmary sink. Carefully she tore out verses and replaced them with lists of names, sketches of bruises, dates when certain children stopped eating, or when the white room smelt of iron instead of salt. It was her only rebellion. Quiet, hidden, and safe, until it wasn't. Her niece Miriam arrived in the last week of August. A sharp-eyed one, sharp-boned child of 9 with a laugh that hadn't yet been broken by the walls of the orphanage. Abigail kept her distance, afraid to draw attention, but left extra bread in the linen basket near her cot and tucked scraps of lavender into her pillow. Miriam lasted 17 days. Then one morning her bed was stripped and her shoes burnt behind the chapel with the others. Grivens offered no answer, just a verse about surrender. That was the last day Abigail ever prayed. The silence in her broke all at once. She began unlocking places no one touched. The pantry where the vinegar was mixed, the laundry where robes were soaked in black oil. But it was the chapel organ that called to her most. The one place Grivens never approached, where a thick velvet curtain stayed drawn even in summer. Behind it, hidden behind the pipes, she found the vent, a narrow shaft wide enough to crawl through, leading downward into the stone. The air was cold but not stale. Something moved in it, something that pulsed with warmth. At the bottom she found no bodies, no bones, only walls carved with symbols older than the orphanage itself, older than scripture, lined in copper that hummed softly without touch. There was no blood, no screams, only stillness. Like breath held for centuries, it was not death. It was waiting, and it had been fed. It began with a low cracking sound behind the east wall of the chapel just after midnight on the coldest night of February 1881. At first, the staff thought it was the floorboards. the same moaning they'd heard for years in the hours when the building seemed to breathe. But this sound was heavier. Then came the smoke, not thick, not choking, but thin and slow, rising up like a whisper from the floorboards of the children's sleeping hall. Abigail Lane smelt it first, a sharp mix of soot and something else, something damp and earthy like burning roots. She ran barefoot across the corridor, lifting 3 children from their beds before the flames found the door. She didn't wait to gather blankets or supplies. She didn't look for the others. She knew they were already gone. The fire moved faster than fire should. It didn't spread along the walls like a normal blaze. It pulsed from inside them, rising out of seams where brick met stone, as if something buried had clawed its way up and now wanted out. Salt cracked and burst from the floor like shattered glass. Copper wires inside the chapel hummed with a pitch no one could hear but could feel in the chest. A pressure, a deep shiver. The altar was lit from beneath, not above. The shoe mound blackened, then vanished. Abigail didn't pray. She didn't scream. She just ran, dragging 3 children through the northern corridor and into the woods behind the annex. She turned only once. Through the back window of the infirmary, she saw a face. Not Grivens, not a child, something else, watching. Still, the fire took everything. Within 2 hours, the entire structure collapsed inward. Roof, tower, chapel, all folded into smoke. The sheriff arrived by dawn. The mayor came with him, silent and pale. Townspeople gathered, some crying, some kneeling, but no one asked questions. No one searched the ash. Grivens was never found. No remains, no bone. No cloth, no trace of his room or his books. The white room was gone. The copper masks melted. Of the 44 children known to have entered the orphanage, only 3 survived that night. Carried out by a woman who no longer blinked, no longer spoke unless forced. She handed over 17 pages. Notes pulled from inside hymnals, soaked in blood, stitched together with gray thread. They contained times, temperatures, pain measurements, diagrams of incisions, musical notations, and the final phrase written in Grivens' hand. The gate requires 44. The town buried the story. A brief report was sent to Austin stating that a boiler explosion had destroyed the orphanage, claiming 20 lives. No mention of the others, no mention of Grivens. The church held a memorial. No names were read. The land was left empty, but no one bought it. No one built there. The river shifted slightly the following year, curving away from the ruins like it no longer wanted to touch the earth. Locals stopped walking the eastern fields. Stories faded. People moved on. But the children who remained, those 3 carried by Abigail, never did. One grew blind. One refused to eat anything but ash-dipped bread. The 3rd hummed a broken tune at every sunset, mouth shut, eyes wide, a song no one else could bear to hear. Abigail vanished 5 years later. Her body was never found. The children were placed in separate homes, different towns, and with new names. But on the 13th anniversary of the fire, each home reported the same thing. An open door, salt spread in a perfect circle beneath the bed, and the faint smell of vinegar clinging to the windowsill. No footprints. No theft. Just silence, the kind that isn't empty but full, listening, watching, like something that never truly burnt, like something waiting again. The spring flood of 1903 came suddenly, violently, and without warning. Heavy rains upstream broke the Black River loose from its banks, dragging mud and uprooted trees through fields that hadn't seen standing water in over a decade. For 2 days, the current clawed at the edge of the old orphanage grounds, now overgrown with weeds and split by cracked stone paths that led nowhere. Locals still refused to walk near it. Children were told it was cursed. Preachers avoided it in sermons, pretending it never existed at all. But the flood didn't avoid it. It dug deep. Deeper than any shovel ever had. And when the waters finally withdrew, they left behind more than mud. Lodged in the exposed earth were bones. Dozens. Most are small, most broken, and several with copper still fused across the skull. The discovery made the Stillwater Ledger by morning. A farmer's dog had unearthed a child's femur wrapped in linen beneath a caved-in section of foundation stone. Within a week, 23 sets of partial remains were catalogued, though investigators quickly admitted they couldn't distinguish where one ended and the next began. Some bones had been deliberately split. Others showed signs of ritual scoring. Thin cuts along the joints, symmetrical and slow. Among the fragments were nails, wax-crusted threads, bits of fused copper wire, and one blackened shoe filled with human teeth. There were no names, no markers, only mass. Silent, sun-bleached testimony from a place the county had long since erased. Pressure built quickly. News of the bones spread, igniting old rumors that had never quite died. A handful of elderly Stillwater residents came forward with memories they had once buried out of fear or guilt. Whispers of locked doors, strange music, and children who arrived but never returned. One woman swore she saw a nurse in the fields in 1882 wandering barefoot and whispering numbers into her palms. But even as curiosity rose, no charges were filed, no suspects named. By then, most who had worked at the orphanage were dead or missing, and the state declared the statute of limitations long past. The land was declared unfit for development due to soil contamination. The remains were placed in unnamed coffins and buried in a shared plot on the northern edge of the property. And over them, a memorial was built. They called it the Silence Memorial. A curved wall of white limestone 10 feet high, etched with 44 names chosen by local school children, none of which matched any record. Beneath each was a symbol, a star, a nail, a spiral, a hook. The same symbols Reverend Grivens had once scrawled into his private ledgers. No one explained where the children found them. At the dedication, a minister from Austin read a prayer about protection and innocence, but his voice cracked midway and he was helped off the podium. In the front row, 3 elderly women held hands without speaking. They had all been orphans once. Each had grown up in separate towns under new names. But the night before the flood, they all claimed to have dreamt of salt circles and a bell ringing far underwater. None of them ever returned after the ceremony. In quiet rooms behind courthouse doors, new policies were drafted. By year's end, orphanages across the state were required to submit biannual ledgers, open their records for inspection, and report every admission and discharge within 72 hours. But these changes were passed quietly, without headlines. No one mentioned the Black River Orphanage by name. No plaque was installed detailing its history. No archives were opened. It became a ghost law, a set of rules born from bones no one wanted to claim. Still, people remembered. Farmers began planting further from the river. Children dared one another to run past the edge of the woods but refused to go near the stone trail. On cold nights, some claimed to hear humming from beneath the earth. The kind of broken tune that didn't follow melody but followed something older. Something that vibrated in the ribs, soft as breath, sharp as glass. And sometimes, near the memorial wall, someone would find strange things left in the grass. A shoe too small for any child, a copper coin etched with a spiral, or a scrap of cloth that smelt of vinegar and wax. Reverend Grivens' name was never spoken at the memorial. His image was never sketched. No portrait was ever found. It was as if he'd been wiped clean from history by the same hands that sealed the children into silence. But he wasn't forgotten. Not really. He lived in the quiet gaps, In the missing names, the faint burns across weathered stone and the copper that refused to rust. And though the building was long gone, the foundation remained buried beneath wild roots and shifting soil. Locals said if you stood there at dusk, the wind didn't move the trees. It circled you, pressed against your skin like breath you couldn't see, like something watching, like something counting. In the end, no justice came, no reckoning, just a memorial no one visited and a law no one spoke of. But some wounds don't heal with trials or tribunals. Some stay open in silence. And the real question was never whether it happened. The bones made that clear. The real question was how it was allowed to go on for so long, unseen, unspoken, unanswered. What kind of evil hides best in plain sight? What kind of system feeds it, praises it, and obeys it? And if it rose once from scripture and smiles, could it rise again from somewhere else, waiting, silent, clean?